Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today we are reviewing A Crown of Swords, the 7th book of the Wheel of Time. So, at the time of recording this video, which is a little over, I guess nearly 2 weeks actually before the video is coming out, I just finished the book this morning. So, you know, this is coming off pretty fresh off the press compared to most of my reviews at this point in time. And I'm looking forward to talking about this. I just got done recording the 5th and final reading diary for this. If you don't know, on this channel, I do reading diaries for all of the Wheel of Time at this point. There's 42 episodes of it now. 5 episodes were on this book, but I have, multiple episodes on every single book where I go through and talk about some of the things that happen in each book and some of my thoughts on it to some degree or another. And that's basically the series. Spoiler talks to some degree, in which I don't necessarily summarize every little thing that happens, but a lot of the major stuff and my thoughts on it, generally speaking. And then I do my normal spoiler-free reviews. So if you haven't read the series, you are safe to watch the review. If you have read the series and you want to know more deeply my thoughts on the actual events of things, you can watch the diaries. And in fact, I think you should, if you have read the books, you should probably actually go watch last week's video, which would have been the last diary for A Crown of Swords, because it does go into more detail on some things that I can't fully say in the review, that I can't go into detail about because of spoilers. I think I could summarize this book in 2 ways. The first off is that if a supposed slog in the Wheel of Time exists, I don't agree that A Crown of Swords is part of it. So that is the one side of my opinion on A Crown of Swords. The second thought that is, if anybody were to call the Crown of Swords underwhelming, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with them. So that's the other side of my opinion. I have these two sides. It's not really a slog. It's not necessarily the greatest book ever either. It's thoroughly fine. It's a good Wheel of Time book. It is a good book as a whole. And that's really like the 2-sentence summary here. With that overview, let's talk about the book entirely, starting off with the good of A Crown of Swords. And the way that I'm going to start this off might be a hot take. I have no idea whether it is or not. I thought that the balance of main stuff versus side stuff and some of the more expositional, like tangential stuff within this book was good. So between all the various different POVs and plot lines, Rand's plot, the girls and Matt's plot, and the side material is basically all put in this book and spread out and gone between effectively pretty well. I never felt like it was super jarring for any POV to be longer than I felt was necessarily justifiable. I never felt like any of them were too short to really get into any details of things going on. I didn't feel like things were switching too much. And even when you have the occasional tangential chapters where you have a side plot or where you have a bunch of mini POVs of other stuff happening, I almost never felt like it was too much. I never felt like there was not enough time given to stuff that is going on in this book, and I felt like the pacing as a whole was pretty good as well. I guess there are a couple of POVs that aren't fully utilized in this book to the degree that they could have. Like Egwene's plotline kind of drops out about halfway through the book. It didn't really bother me because it went through what it needed to in this portion. The only real exception, I guess, aside from Egwene, is that Perrin's POV disappears at a time, at a spot where you feel like it probably shouldn't have, but I'm not going to complain about this the same way that I'm not going to complain about the fact that Perrin wasn't in book 5 and that he was largely not in book 6, because it meant that I could avoid Zareen. Although, to be fair, Perrin's time in this book was generally pretty good. In fact, the next point of the good for A Crown of Swords is that Perrin's POV in the first 5 chapters of the book following the prologue was really, really good, almost entirely. It really gave me some vibes of the Dragon Reborn in there, using Perrin as a vessel to view Rand from a unique vantage, because of course Perrin, being a wolf brother, has ways in which he views and interprets the world and interprets other people and what's going on with them, being able to smell different emotions and stuff like that. Perrin has a very unique way of viewing the world, and I thought that those first few chapters of the book were a fantastic way to get into that, and to be able to explore Rand from a little bit of a different vantage after Lord of Chaos was so heavily focused on Rand. I really liked that. And when Zareen wasn't around in these chapters, Perrin was absolutely brilliant, just like, the last 2 chapters of Lord of Chaos, in which Perrin actually was able to shine and be his own person. Those moments are really fantastic. By getting to see Rand this way as well, we also got to witness some great political tension within the book, laying some seeds for plot development ahead in the series. We were also given a lot of this book, especially the first half of it, being basically a reaction, way to view the ramifications of Dumai's Wells, the end of Lord of Chaos. This is kind of like a bridge novel following Lord of Chaos, because that event was so impactful and so massive that you kind of have to spend a little bit of time dealing with the consequences of that, and of Crown of Swords does that pretty well. And more so than just the politics on Rand's side, there's some other politics going on between various different factions as well. The Abu Dar plotline has some political stuff going on between a couple different people, Aes Sedai and a new group that we get to meet in this book. There's also some political stuff going on between some antagonistic factions in here as well. One of those is really introduced as a, I guess, tertiary plot line within the prologue, and gets a couple of scenes throughout as well. So, there's some good political stuff in A Crown of Swords. I felt like the overall plot development as well was pretty solid. The pacing in this is definitely no worse than either Lord of Chaos or The Shadow Rising, which I believe are the 2 most poorly paced books in the series up to this point. In the case of The Shadow Rising, I felt like its pacing isn't terrible, but it did start to feel a little bit bloated compared to the first 3 books for me. Is also a little bit weaker than Fires of Heaven in that way. Lord of Chaos, the first third of it was paced and written quite brilliantly, but let's say the middle third of it, I guess, started to feel a good bit bloated, and the final third of it didn't feel like the end of a book until the last 4 chapters. The rest of it kind of felt like it was starting another book again, due in no small part to one of the plot lines that was started in that, in which this book features heavily, but we'll talk about that pretty soon. My general opinion is that the pacing of A Crown of Swords is really not substantially different to anything in the Wheel of Time thus far. So if you've had no issues with the pacing of the first 6 books, you're probably not going to have that many problems, if any, with The Crown of Swords, because it's just more of that. And in fact, the splitting between POVs is kind of, I hinted at earlier, the POV allotment is actually better in this than I would say a couple of the books in the series up to this point. Even though the book as a whole is somewhat weaker than some of those books, the POV allotment is pretty solid. So, that's my opinion on that. There isn't necessarily a whole ton of stuff happening per se with some of the plot lines, say especially with Rand's plot line in The Crown of Swords. There isn't that much active plot development, not that much new stuff actually occurring, moving things forward. But you don't necessarily need that. As I said, A Crown of Swords is kind of like a bridge following Lord of Chaos, exploring the ramifications, essentially, of what Dumai's Wells did, what happened there, and the importance of all of that. And Crown of Swords is largely exploring that, so it's not necessarily that big of a problem that not a whole ton actively happens with Rand. Conversely, some of the other plot lines do feature some big moments. I would say that the Abu Dar plotline especially moved along pretty nicely, and I don't really understand the complaints associated with the Bowl of the Winds plotline at this point. My only complaint with it is that it started in that last third of Lord of Chaos, making that last third of Lord of Chaos feel like the beginning of a book, instead of letting the entire plotline exist in this book to some degree. You could have cut out some of the material in the plotline, put it all in this book, and it would have been a really self-contained plot, and honestly, really awesome. So is it a little bit more bloated than it needed to be just on account of existing and the end of Lord of Chaos, and then going through the entirety of this book? Yeah, I guess you could maybe argue that there's a little bit more to it than it strictly needs, but I didn't feel like any of it was bad, and it definitely didn't bring the book down for me. I found the pacing and the reveals and the character work, especially within all of this material, pretty satisfying in most ways. In fact, speaking of character development, I would say that A Crown of Swords had pretty good character development across the board. I was pretty worried about Rand pretty early on for a little while, being a little bit more one note mentally, but that didn't end up necessarily being a problem. It didn't do anything enough through the rest of the book where I was actually bothered by it. So even though I was worried, I didn't have reason to be worried. Egwene is getting to know her place amongst the Aes Sedai pretty well in this book. You get some pretty big moments in there. Both Nynaeve and Elaine have some pretty impactful moments for their own personal characters. Not going to say any more than that, but Nynaeve especially has a really great moment in this book. Matt really comes to his own in terms of his personality. He becomes like a really engaging character, whereas previously he was either pretty tangential or he was a straight up asshole in the first few books. And even when he wasn't in, say, like the second trilogy, books 4 through 6, he just didn't. He felt a little bit more like a nothing burger of a character than anything. He just kind of existed. He didn't fully have his own personality. You could tell there was a little bit of that coming through, but not a ton. He was just too reserved. In this book, you really feel him actually becoming like really, really his own person. I appreciated being able to see that, despite some issues within, you know, his life within this book being some pretty big problems. I'd say simultaneously, the recovery from Lord of Chaos within this book in terms of like the plot and the characters, the recovery from all of that stuff, as well as setting up for the future, was also all very good. Not just in the main characters and all of the main plot lines, I would say some of the side plot lines also do some of this stuff. I already talked about kind of a tertiary storyline that starts off in the prologue to some degree, and then moves on all the way through to like the second to last chapter, basically. Or maybe that was something I said in last week's video. I forget at this point. I'm recording them back to back. Even so, the side plot lines, at least the long-term series side plot lines, get to have some pretty big moments. Like Morgase's plot line sets up some things to come, and sets up something alongside the not second to last chapter, but the end of the Abu Dar plotline features something in that vein as well. If you've read the book, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and I feel like that stuff is going to have ramifications on a pretty major antagonist through probably the next couple of books, if not the next few books within the series. So yeah, like a lot of this was good. I was pretty worried about a middling climax, but all of the plot lines aside from Perrin's in this book has some form of climactic event to justify where it ends. Even though I mentioned that like the Egwene POV, for example, doesn't really exist in the back half of the book. It goes through what it needs to and doesn't end in such a way that's like, okay, well, where was more Egwene? It's like, okay, I can accept getting more Egwene a little bit later. She didn't strictly need to exist in the back half. Most of her existing in the front half was supplementary to the other plot lines already happening. But even though there is all of that stuff that I enjoyed a lot about A Crown of Swords, there are some things that I've got to say weren't the strongest within the book. The first thing that I would put into the section of the bad is not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. In fact, the further the book went on, and I've kind of already described this dynamic of the book being a bridge following Lord of Chaos, kind of exploring the importance of those events. The prologue felt a little bit weird to me at first because it felt just as much like a secondary epilogue to Lord of Chaos as it did a prologue to this book. There were some POVs within there that were like, why wasn't this at the end in the epilogue of Lord of Chaos? And there were some POVs in here that was just like, if you restructured this a little bit more, this is a fantastic prologue for this one. So it felt like it existed in a weird place. But like I said, as I kind of continued reading along, this became less of a problem for me as the entire book is more or less following after the end of Lord of Chaos rather than being its own thing. Like the book doesn't actually start to do its own thing entirely until like 2/3 of the way through, because most of what it contains is stuff that was started or things that happened in the end of Lord of Chaos. Even the Abu Dar plotline, like I said, the Bull of the Winds technically starts in the last third of Lord of Chaos. And that's a lot of what the Abu Dar plotline in here is about. It's all about that kind of stuff. So a lot of this is just kind of like living in the shadow of Lord of Chaos. And while that does mean that A Crown of Swords is kind of overshadowed a little bit. I don't think it's awful, but I could see some other people finding that to be a little bit more boring than I did, perhaps. I would also argue that A Crown of Swords didn't quite have enough of the side stuff. I've talked about the side stuff in here being good, but it's kind of a continued complaint that I've had with the series as a whole, is that there are certain plot lines happening in here that I want to see more of, but that like only show up maybe once every like half book, if that. And that's about as frequently as you get to see anything related to that. So it just feels like some stuff moves at a glacial pace in this series. There are a couple new side plots that start off in this book, especially in the prologue, and those things get some scenes throughout. But the one major side plot line that I wanted more of also only got one major scene within the book, following a sort of minor scene in the start, which minor scene in that it wasn't really substantial, didn't take up too much space, even though the thing that happened in it is pretty big for that plot line. I would say like the main plots get really deep development in this series. The main storylines do, the main POVs do, for obvious reasons. The side stuff feels like it moves at a much slower pace than it should, especially in this book, because like I said, a lot of that stuff gets like maybe just a couple of chapters, a couple of POVs in each book. So even though not a whole ton of time is going on in each book, like they're pretty condensed timeline wise, like sometimes it's only, you know, a few weeks or something like that some of these books appear to go in, depending on the plot line. But some of the side stuff, it's like, okay, but like I would like to see some more stuff from over here so that it's not literally 150,000, 200,000 words within the entire series before I get another chapter of this. So it's less a complaint with The Crown of Swords specifically and more with the series as a whole. But definitely something that I felt like was worth noting. I wanted more Morghese. Again, that was a complaint that I had in Lord of Chaos. I wanted to have more of that plot line. And again, I was kind of left wanting in this one. Beyond all of that stuff, I would also say that A Crown of Swords has a potentially / somewhat actually underwhelming resolution in both of the major plot lines that needed resolution by that point in the book, because I've talked about how everything gets a climax of sorts, but there's something a little bit lacking about the two major ones at the end. The first one being the Ebu Dar one has a good climax, but the actual end of the plotline in this book is a little bit more of a cliffhanger. I don't necessarily hate cliffhangers, so this didn't bother me a whole ton. I could see it bothering a lot of other people a little bit more than it did for me, but even so, I don't love cliffhangers, so I'm like, I didn't necessarily need that to be the case, but I can see what Jordan's going for, and I'm not unenthused by it at all. It's just kind of a point of like, yeah, but I need to see more of this before I know how I feel about it. Chapter 41 as well, the very last chapter in the book, is pretty conflicted between being both momentous and kind of uncertain for me as well, how I feel about it. This seems to be at least somewhat intentional on Jordan's part, so I'm not saying that he didn't execute on what he was trying, because I think he probably did, but I just don't really know how to feel about the ending of this book. On the one hand, it was awesome, and the actual result of it is great, not necessarily too dissimilar from the ending of the Dragon Reborn in that way. If you know, you know. But on the other hand, well, let's just say that the confrontation that was associated with it kind of ended somewhat middlingly. If you want to know more about how I felt about that specifically, go watch Wheel of Time Diary episode 42 if you've read the series, because I go into all of that in the spoiler talk. You can obviously go to the timestamps in that description and jump to the chapter 42 section, or jump to the chapter 41 section, where I actually talk about all of that last chapter and why I feel a little bit conflicted about it in certain ways. Not going to go into that here because that would be spoilers. To be fair to the book, however, I could say that it did kind of make me want to continue into Path of Daggers, book 8, immediately, but it definitely wasn't enough to make me regret that I'm waiting a few weeks up to a month at this point before I actually start Path of Daggers. So it wasn't enough of a cliffhanger to really get me hooked in that way, but it wasn't one that necessarily horribly turned me off. I'm just a little bit conflicted about the end of this book rather than being outright positive or outright negative. One final thing that I'll say for the bad of Crown of Swords is that at this point, it seems like there's a little bit too many names, too many little details that are beginning to be a little bit too hard to keep track of. Now, to be fair to the series, the time that I'm spending in between reading the books is partially to blame for this. I'm not going to deny that at all, but even with that fact, there's just a little bit too much to remember. I am frequently referencing things like the Wheel of Time Compendium app on my phone, basically after almost every chapter, just to kind of double check on certain characters to make sure that I have things straight in my head. And I'm also getting pointers in my Wheel of Time diaries from at least one mega fan of the series who's correcting details on my end because of stuff that I've forgotten or I'm just happening to get wrong on account of there being a little bit too much. In the early portions of the series, the first few books, I was like, I don't really get why it is that people say there's so many names or so many characters or whatever. Like, I feel like I'm keeping track pretty well, and I was at that point. But by the time, like, I would say Lord of Chaos especially, by the time I had so much time in between reading The Fires of Heaven and Lord of Chaos, reading New Spring in between them, Lord of Chaos and Crown of Swords have been this kind of bridge, this gap, where I finally come to a point where, like, there's just too much to remember. I'm somebody who doesn't necessarily need much to remember little details anyway. Like, I've been a person who's been known in the past, especially in my teen years, to be able to drop books even for literally years in between, like in the middle of a book, and then to pick it back up when I'm finally back in the mood for it, and still be able to remember a lot of the major stuff that I was reading, and furthermore, to be able to be reminded of stuff that I had forgotten, things being brought up in such a way within the books that it's just like, oh yeah, okay, and now I remember all of this stuff. So the stuff that wasn't actively in my brain was like, you know, open the floodgates and it all came rushing back in. I feel like I'm struggling with that kind of thing here. I can still do that, actually, to some degree. The problem is that Wheel of Time at this point in the series is starting to take a little bit too much active RAM, to the point where I'm having to throw just as much information right out the other end as goes into it, sometimes immediately if it is not immediately relevant, due in no small part to the fact that Jordan likes to focus on very minor details that often unimportant, like, you know, almost every single time a character is brought up in a new scene, he describes what they're wearing, and while I don't necessarily have a problem with that inherently, it does mean that a bunch of random details are getting filtered out immediately by my brain because it doesn't actually matter. And this is becoming a problem with, like, characters and stuff. There's so many characters that it's just too hard to keep track for me at this point, and that's kind of unfortunate. So that's going to be a problem moving into the rest of the series, but maybe me knowing that will help me in the future, but I kind of doubt it will. The last thing that I would put into the bad we're actually going to use to move into the ugly, and say that A Crown of Swords actually contains some pretty major sexual assault stuff going on in this one, like actually pretty significant moments of it. And it's just a little bit different from the way that this kind of subject is normally tackled in books, because the target is usually a woman. In this case, the target is a man, which I guess is kind of like a minor spoiler for something that happens, but I think it's important to note if you're somebody who's really sensitive to, like, this kind of subject in the, you know, inverse to how it's typically explored, because it's kind of underexplored generally in fiction. And if you're sensitive to it potentially being explored improperly, there might be a degree to which you have a problem with Jordan doing that in this book, and that you should anticipate that ahead of time so that maybe it doesn't piss you off quite as much as it pisses off some other people, or at least one other person who I know who really, really, really hated this stuff. And to be fair, I didn't necessarily love it either, but I overall thought that Jordan handled it okay, whereas one of my friends didn't think that Jordan handled it quite as well. On account of the particular character that it's happening to, there are some people who will take issue to it because it feels like it's almost being made fun of, or if not being made fun of, like the subject is not really handled respectfully, like Jordan's making light of sexual assault against men. I don't necessarily agree with that. But because of the character that it's happening to, and some of the other side characters, or rather, they're not even really side characters, they're just people who exist in the world, also kind of making fun of it and finding amusement in it for one reason or another, it can, I guess, feel a little bit disrespectful to that subject. I, again, didn't necessarily feel like Jordan handled it super poorly, even if I was still enraged by those scenes, because it's just so pathetic. Like, it's really pathetic how bad of a person the character that's doing it is, despite being seen basically by the other people around them that it isn't a bad thing or that they aren't a bad character. It's really kind of unfortunate to see that, you know, that specific dynamic happen in the book. But again, I didn't feel like it was super disrespectful, but it could come off as disrespectful, and the subject is pretty sensitive one in the first place, so that's why I put this one in the ugly, and it's kind of a soft spot there. As for the recommendation of the entire book, however, if the Wheel of Time hasn't turned you off at this point in the series, if you haven't already bailed or something like that, in which case I don't know why you'd be watching my review of this, this could be a breaking point for some people. I know there are some people who've been like notably less enthused with the Crown of Swords versus previous books in the series, even though I personally don't necessarily get it. For me, I would say this definitely wasn't a breaking point for me at all. Totally continue on to this point if you've already read up through Lord of Chaos. After such a momentous ending in Lord of Chaos, this book is definitely needed to be able to recover from some of that. At this point in time, I'm actually not quite sure how I'd rank this in comparison to the other non-5 out of 5 Wheel of Time books, because, spoiler alert, even though I don't really rate books in my video reviews, I would say that this is one of the ones that isn't 5 out of 5. I would give this 4 out of 5 on Goodreads. Where it would rank amongst the other 4 out of 5 rated Goodreads books here, I would say that this one's probably on the higher end of the scale. It's a little bit closer to being 5 out of 5, but on account of being slightly underwhelmed with some things, such as the very ending, that very last chapter in particular, I can't really justify doing that. Even so, I would say it's a little bit higher on that 4 out of 5 spectrum for the Wheel of Time. So that's where I fall on it at the very least. But yeah, I guess that is the totality of this review. Yet again, I have ended up with a video much longer than I intended for it to be, so I appreciate you watching this if you did. At this point, it'll only be a few weeks before I start reading Path of Daggers, book 8 in the series, and I'm looking forward to that, despite it being one of the often 2 lowest ranked books in the main series. I'm looking forward to it nonetheless. Thank you again for watching. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me Casey, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.